Hello. Hi, Saba. Nice to see you. Um, okay, I think it's fine for us to just start and hope for the best with the Shahwar's ability to join this. Um, but first of all, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to panel 2B of Writing Muslim Women in South Asia. Uh, this panel is titled Dwelling the Archive. We've tried to do a little bit of a riff on Antoinette Burton's book that the collective is quite fond of, but also the work of all the panelists today has done that in one way or the other. So we're really pleased to have all of you present here. I forgot to do this in the previous panel, so I'm just going to kind of quickly do that. I am Zehra Kazmi, for those of you who don't know. I'm a PhD student at the University of St. Andrews, and my work is on nostalgia and South Asian Muslim writing. Um, but yeah, so I was thinking, I don't want to spend too much time on formalities and maybe potentially just kind of get to all of these very exciting papers that we have today. But I want to kind of provide quick introductions for this fantastic panel that we have with us today. Yeah, sorry. So we start off today with Professor Claire Chambers, who is a professor of global literatures at the University of York, where she teaches literature from South Asia, the Perso-Arab world, and their diasporas. She's the author of several books, including Written Through Muslim Eyes, Rivers of Ink, and Making Sense of Contemporary British Muslim Novels. She has edited Dastarkhan, or Desi Delicacies, as some of you might know it, food writing from Muslim South Asia, and has also co-edited A Match Made in Heaven and co-authored Storying Relationships. Thanks so much, Claire, Professor Chambers. I keep switching between that for joining us today. We're so glad that you've managed to take out the time. Um, we also have with us today Haider Shahbaz, who is doing a PhD in comparative literatures at UCLA. He previously studied history at Yale. He's the translator of Mirza Athar Beg Hassan's State of Affairs for HarperCollins, and the editor of a special volume Against the Canon, Urdu Feminist Writing for Words Without Borders. Other writings and translations have appeared in Asymptote, Brooklyn Rail, Los Angeles Review of Books, The Caravan, Dawn, and elsewhere. Thank you so much for joining us, Haider. Um, we have with us after that Saba Nehal, who has read English at Lady Shri Ram College for Women, also my alma mater, and received a master's in literature and modernity from the University of Edinburgh. She is interested in contemporary literature, particularly literature from South Asia and queer Muslim experience. Currently, she's an assistant editor at an independent publishing firm. Finally, our second featured speaker for this panel is Professor Neetu Khanna, an associate professor of comparative lit at the University of Southern California. Her areas of interest include theories and literatures of decolonization, global Marxisms, post-colonial literature and theory, materialist aesthetics, and queer and feminist theory. Her recent book, which is fantastic, by the way, and I would highly recommend because I've been going through it for my thesis as well. The Visceral Logics of Decolonization by Duke University Press, published in 2020, rethinks the global project of decolonization by exploring a set of relations between embodied experience and political feeling that she conceptualizes as visceral, centering on an archive of Muslim internationalist art and literature emerging between the 1930s and 50s in India. Thanks so much for joining us, Professor Khanna, all the way from the States. Yeah, I think we can sort of start ahead with you, Claire, if you're ready. And yeah, will you be sharing your screen, or would you like
Yes, I'm happy to share my screen. Shall I do that? So thank you
Yeah.
so much, Zehra. It's really nice to meet you and everybody, and to reconnect with Haider, who I last met in Pakistan at FC College, and to meet my fellow panelists for the first time. So I will share my screen. Okay. And is that okay? I'll just give me 2 seconds.
Yeah, that's all good. We can see us.
Is it good? Okay. I'm gonna just.
And before you start, I just want to sort of a reminder that the featured speakers, that is Claire and Neetu, have 20 to 30 minutes for their presentations, and Saba and Shahwar, if she's able to join us, and Haider, you have 15 minutes each. So yeah, let's make sure that we keep to the time limits just so the keynote starts in time. Thank you so much.
Shahwar is here, Zehra.
That's wonderful. Great. Shahwar, I'll just sort of briefly introduce you this. I'm so sorry, Claire, but
Fine.
yeah. Shahwar Kibria Maqhfi is a PhD student and Tech Humanities Fellow in the Department of Ethnomusicology at UCLA. She has an MPhil in Cinema Studies from the School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU, Delhi, and a Master's in Film Studies from Jadavpur University. She theorizes on Indo-Islamic music, Muslim Urdu cultural worlds, and global film, media, and audiovisual cultures in South Asia and beyond. Her writings have appeared in Economic and Political Weekly and First Post. Thanks so much for joining us, Shahwar. But great, we can now start with Claire, and Shahwar, you will be our second speaker after Claire, if that's okay.
Great, thank you. And that also gives me the opportunity to say a proper thank you to the Tasawwuf Collective, which I think it's such an exciting initiative. And I also want to thank Sheila Leaper, Sahana, and Zehra Fatima Zehra. So just to explain my structure, I'm going to talk about these two writers, Atiya Faizi and Maimuna Sultan, especially looking at their writing styles and the experience that they had in London before trying to come to some conclusion. And I will try to keep this certainly, like, ideally to 20 minutes, because I don't want to hog, because yeah, we are starting a little bit late. So in the early 20th century, these are the earliest examples of Muslim women travel writers in Britain that I have been able to find. They are Atiya Faizi, whose dates are 1877 to 1967, and Shahbanu Begum Maimuna Sultan, 1900 to 1982. Atiya came to Britain as a single woman, aged nearly 30, to study at the Maria Gray Teacher Training College from 1906 to 1907. Here, she wrote letters to her sisters about her European experience. These letters were serialized soon after in an Urdu women's journal, published as a book in 1921, and reproduced as Siobhan Lambert Hurley and Sunil Sharma's comprehensive English translation, Atiya's Journeys, 2010. And I was delighted to see that Siobhan is in the program, but unfortunately in the parallel session. But her work is brilliant, and I recommend it very highly, along with Sunil Sharma's. 5 years later, in 1911, my other writer, Maimuna Sultan, departed for England by steamship from Bombay, making stops in Aden and France, and glimpsing a Sicilian volcano during her journey. Just 14 years old when she published her book, A Trip to Europe, Maimuna could trace her lineage back from a long line of women travel writers. She made her journey to England with her mother-in-law, Nawab Sultan Jahan Begum of Bhopal, who had written an account of her pilgrimage to Hijaz in 1903 to 1904. Unsurprisingly, given her mother-in-law's royal status, the purpose of Maimuna's 1911 trip was more highfalutin than Atiya's pursuit of education. Maimuna and Her Highness were to pay their respects at George V's coronation. Now, the Faizis were from an aristocratic Sulaimani Bohra Muslim background. Atiya's father had a strong Turkish mercantile connection, and she was born in Constantinople, raised in Bombay, and died in relative poverty in Karachi. The Afghan-born Maimuna Sultan was born in Peshawar and brought up in Bhopal by the Nawab Begum from the age of 5. Both of these authors demonstrate the porous borders between India, Afghanistan, Turkey, and modern-day Pakistan in the early 20th century. Writing just a few years after the death of Queen Victoria, Atiya was a recognisably modern and independent traveller. This was reflected in her middle-brow modernist style, which was often frivolous and hyperbolic. She wrote of a trip into central London a few months after arriving in Britain, and I quote, "How many lights, what costumes, such fashionable women," end quote. Her narrative was punctuated with the humorous exclamations, "Oho, oof," and "aha ha ha." On the other hand, writing in the immediate pre-war period, Maimuna used a ponderous Victorian style when reconstructing George V's coronation through second-hand reporting. So Maimuna solemnly and archaically wrote, quote, "A shout of God save King George springing from loyal hearts rent the air," end quote. Now, I think this difference in tone can be accounted for, first, by the fact that Maimuna was half Atiya's age and exhibited the earnestness of an overprotected teenager. By contrast, Atiya was worldly and did not lack for male attention, from writers Maulana Shibli Nomani and Allama Iqbal, no less. Second, Maimuna's royal blood marginally trumped Atiya's pedigree, but smothered her with rules about purdah. The sequestered Maimuna, wrote Lambert Hurley and Sharma devastatingly, quote, "gave the impression that she saw little more than the inside of hotels and curtained motor cars," end quote. Maimuna was stranded in London's suburbs rather than being close to the capital's action, as was Atiya. The greatest impact on Maimuna was the Nawab Begum, whose influence is easily discernible in this travelogue. And I've got a quote that I'll just read to you, actually. So again, quote, "Her Highness says that Turkey has yet many things to learn and do, the Turks being in almost all respects a long way behind Europe. Her Highness admits that owing to their religious training, they are not wanting in Islamic civility and hospitality, but it is very sad that they have begun to show a sort of indifference to religion. Her Highness was especially struck with this religious remissness, which sometimes seemed to surpass what is usually noticed in India," end quote. So each of the sentences that I read you begins with Her Highness, suggesting that the Begum's opinions have been directly decanted into Maimuna's reportage. Although it bears pointing out that the passage may not contain the same repetitious wording in the Urdu original, another imprint on this travelogue, above and beyond the usual changes that happen when one conveys a text into another language, comes from its translator, Mrs. G.B. Baksh's insider status. Mrs. Baksh was a member of Her Highness's entourage on the European tour and had mistress of Sultania, a prominent girls' school in Bhopal set up by the Begum. In a translator's preface to the text, Mrs. Baksh asserts, and again this is a quote, she says, "The young writer, who is only 14, is to be congratulated on the success of her attempt. The keen sense of observation displayed throughout, the ease and grace with which the notes jotted down in a diary have been strung into a narrative, and above all, the modesty with which the story is told, are really worthy of a pupil of Her Highness," end quote. The detail that modesty is prized above all the book's other qualities tells us much about the filtration and fortification this narrative has undergone. Indeed, as Lambert Hurley and Sharma write, quote, "A recurring theme in these texts was the relationship between purdah, or the South Asian practice of veiling and seclusion, and travel," end quote. As has already been intimated, because she was an older woman and ruler of powerful princely state, the Begum was able to gad about Europe behind the liberating screen of her veil, while the young and desirable Maimuna was confined to hotels, rented houses, and their secure grounds. Maimuna summarizes this in the following laconic words, quote, "We, my sister-in-law and myself, did not go about in burqa as Her Highness did," end quote. Now, Atiya's family had a more unusual approach to women's attire and confinement, as she explains. And again, this is a quote. She said, so this is Atiya, "I have continued wearing my Indian clothes and do not intend to ever give them up. When I go out, I cover my head, etc., with a gauze cloth. Everything is covered except the face. And our faizi charshaf on our body, gloved hands, umbrella, good walking shoes on the feet. Altogether, it seems to be a complete, simple outfit. And everyone appreciates the fact greatly that I have kept my ways in the English world and am setting a good example. Of course, I have modified the charshaf faizi a bit, which serves well instead of an English cloak," end quote. So this quotation reveals that Atiya does not seek to assimilate through the adoption of Western dress. In fact, she finds a woman who's done just that absurd, and delicately explains to this Indian housewife who's lived in London for 2 years, she says to her, quote, "We can continue wearing our clothes in this country without any problems," end quote. Rather than going native, she wears her own family version of the veil, the faizi charshaf, which is an adaptation of Turkish women's floor-length cloaks worn with a sewn head covering and gloves. Note too, that a sentence containing the phrase "everyone appreciates" in the quote showed that Atiya had one eye on her host's reception of and reactions to her supposedly exotic yet modest outfit. The charshaf enabled Atiya to travel where and with whom she wanted. Rather than the supposedly oppressive veil that is such a Western obsession to this day, the garment had an unshackling effect. It could easily be adapted to a different context, as Atiya showed by teaming it with good walking shoes and modifying it to a thicker version designed to keep out the cold in lieu of a cloak. Moreover, it was not as if there were no restrictions on British women at the same time. When Atiya Faizi went to see the famed English contralto Clara Butts sing, she had nothing but pity for her. And so in the text it says, this is a quote, "Regarding the waist, I remembered this line of poetry. Divan me khali hi jaga trod di main ne mazmun hai banda teri nazik kamarika." And she translates this as, "I left a blank spot in my book of poetry when I created an image of your delicate waist." And then Atiya goes on to say, God knows how Clara Butt, can bind herself and sing in such a constricted state, and that too with a smile. These people bear all kinds of torture for the sake of appearance, end quote. So in observing the cinched-in waist of the singer, Atiya was reminded of the ever tinier waists of Persian and Urdu poetry's beloveds, which shows that she astutely understands women's oppressions across cultures. So now let's talk more about the two women's experiences in London. Both women retained their pluralist Islamic faith while travelling in Europe and were not seduced by the various brands of Christianity and secularity they encountered there. Atiya's distinctly Muslim sensibility was clear when she viewed the new underground railway as being, quote, "the workings of a jinn," end quote. And Maimuna was skeptical of a shrine in Cairo that was rumoured to possess healing properties, but joyous when the Turkish Sultan gave her mother-in-law a relic said to be the hair of Prophet Muhammad. Yet the two writers frequently rubbed up against fixed ideas about so-called Mohammedans in Imperial London. Atiya attended a talk at which Muslims were described as a backward-looking and slothful community. Remarkably, she found herself in agreement, saying, "Dear sisters, he spoke the truth. If we feel bad, that's our choice," end quote. Thus, it is apparent that these women were perhaps too willing to accept Orientalist criticism of Muslim societies. Indeed, Maimuna argues that it is not wrong to tell one's co-religionists their weak points, censuring the Turks, for example, for not having any so-called lady doctors, despite their Muslim faith. Both women were sold on the significance of education, which they regarded as the only route to women's and Muslims' uplift. As Atiya, the budding teacher, argued, quote, higher education is a heavenly thing, end quote. Her Highness also valued learning, telling Maimuna that education is, quote, a jewel whose luster can never fade, end quote. Importantly, though, Atiya speculated on when there would be universal education for South Asian girls. Occasional reticence of tone is an additional facet of these women writers' difference from their male traveller compatriots that has received little scholarly attention. At particular moments, both women's narrative powers apparently fail them. Atiya frequently bemoans that certain things are hard to put in words, and it ends sentences with the mock helpless disclaimer, what can I say? Maimuna, understandably enough, gives a proviso about the central scene in her own narrative from which she is absent, saying, quote, I saw very little of the coronation celebrations to be able to describe them to my readers, end quote. With less justification, she makes a similar comment after a viewing of holy relics in Turkey that she does attend, saying, it was a scene which my humble pen cannot attempt to describe, end quote. Does this reflect disingenuousness or a genuine lack of confidence on the part of these women writers? The evidence suggests it's a bit of both. As Susan Bassnett suggests, British travel writing generally tends to employ a tone of self-deprecation and irony. It was thus an expected feature of Muslim travel writers in Britain to be somewhat diffident about their abilities. Yet, in spite of their privilege, I would argue that the women are, in Kirsten Hulse-Peterson and Anna Rutherford's terms, in a position of double colonisation in Britain because of their gender and their race or religion. I've already discussed some instances of the patronising stance many Londoners took towards them. Another example can be found when Atiya meets with some lecturers to discuss the best course for education in India. So this is another quote. It says, but they, the lecturers, lead the conversation in such a way and acquire the information that I am under the impression they are only questioning me. In fact, the truth is that they know about India so well that what can I say? When I sometimes express my thoughts and make a mistake, they tactfully refute it in the course of the discussion to show me the error. What is talking and discussing with them but laying the foundation of learning, end quote. So in this quote, Atiya thinks the lecturers want to learn from her about India, but it soon becomes apparent that they are grilling her only in order to prove their supposedly superior knowledge of her country. It is hard to tell whether the last sentence of her quotation is ironic in tone or she is expressing a genuine cultural cringe when she says, what is talking and discussing with them but laying the foundation of learning? Racial subjugation isn't the only form of oppression these women undergo, and the gender symmetry affects even the more obviously, quote unquote, liberated Atiya, as well as the ostentatiously secluded Maimuna. So, for example, for Atiya, who seems to be quite independent, when she goes to Port Said and there's a stop, her brother Ali Asa advises her against getting off the boat. So she too has some restrictions on gendered lines. Words that Atiya frequently reaches for to describe Europe include stunning and amazing, and variants such as stunned or amazed. Despite this, there are moments when the reader can discern behind her narratorial lightness that longing for home, even depression, that may have contributed to the curtailment of her trip. The reader observes this when she writes, quote, I cannot ever imagine liking this country enough to remain here forever, quote, unquote. And she later remarks of an invitation to Kensington Palace, quote, I don't feel like it at all, therefore I won't go, end quote. This suggests that equally as interesting as these sketches of life in Britain is what is not included in the texts. Atiya had to leave the host land early, ostensibly because of her health, and she returned to India via the Netherlands and France, as well as Germany, where she reunited with Allama Iqbal. Lambert Hurley and Sharma argue that she may have been lovesick due to her frustrating friendship with the poet. But one would not guess this from her sprightly prose. In Paris, for example, Atiya comments in terms reminiscent of the reverse Orientalism of earlier male travellers like Abu Talib Khan. She said, "The Eiffel Tower is a famous minar that has several levels," end quote. The fact that her audience is composed of her sisters and the Urdu magazine's readership is significant and is partly a part of this cultural translation where she's calling the Eiffel Tower a minar and explaining how it works. But it also leads to probable self-censorship, as well as the editor's own excisions. As mentioned earlier, Atiya has already had a relationship with a Persian language poet, Shibli, that had caused a major scandal. But still more tongues are set wagging by her friendship with Iqbal, despite the fact that he is rarely mentioned in these letters home. Iqbal sent her some poems and many letters, but may have been more interested in a German woman during their time at Heidelberg. Saeed Naqvi's suggestion that they were lovers notwithstanding. Atiya would go on to write a book about her relationship with Iqbal, which goes some way towards addressing the glaring absence in the travelogue. Atiya and Maimuna had quite different audiences, and Maimuna was doubtless also aware that her work would be read by her mother-in-law, so that was one reason why she quoted her so frequently. As with Atiya, there's also much that Maimuna does not reveal. For example, having been very polite about Northern Europe, when she reaches Turkey, she writes frankly, "It was a pleasant sight to see an Islamic country after 5 months," end quote. We know Maimuna must have married young, given that she is already the Begum's daughter-in-law by the time of her European journey. Maimuna's grandson, Shahriar M. Khan's memoir, reveals that his grandmother became a child bride at just 5 to a husband, Habibullah, who was only 11, and that the Begum decided when the couple were ready to consummate their marriage, 18 for Hamidullah and Maimuna a mere 12. Still, there is no mention of a husband in a trip to Europe, and the only reference to Hamidullah is in the parenthetical aside, Princess Hamidullah Khan, on the book's frontispiece and translator's preface. So if the reader wishes to find out whether or not child marriage causes misery, she must cast her net more widely than this reticent and entirely proper travel book. It is Shahriar who informs that Maimuna and Hamidullah made a handsome, modern and happy couple. And even then, one might suspect this is the rosy view of the grandchild viewing his elder's marriage from the outside. At this juncture, it seems appropriate to look at the paper's titular quotation, Atiya Faizi's assertion that, quote, "truly a person progresses by travelling and interacting with different peoples," end quote. In context, she is describing her friendship in London with the Maharanis of Baroda and Cooch Behar, women who would not have met her on such an equal footing in India. Atiya was changed in other ways by her time in Britain. After partition, she built a house in Karachi, inspired by the Bombay Tayabji house, which itself had origins in her family's love of England, and perhaps also by the Muslim Iberian Alhambra, indicating her dual loyalties to Europe and Islam. As Peter Hume and Tim Woods observe, one of the main benefits of travel and of writing of it lies in its independence of perspective, both from the traveller's foreign surroundings and his or her nations of origin. As we have seen, Atiya Faizi and Shahbanu Begum Maimuna Sultan were aristocratic women who wrote travel texts about their sojourns in 1990s Britain. 1900s Britain. I analysed the two women's travelogues together as there are areas of productive overlap between them, even though they are very different in style and tone. To conclude, these writers might be elite and unorthodox in their religious views and lifestyles, but between them, Atiya and Maimuna shared some of the period's common experiences of South Asian women at this time, including, but not limited to, child marriage, domineering relatives, and purdah. We have observed that Atiya was probably the more bohemian of the two, and it is also worth noting the unconventional facts that not one of the three Faizi sisters had children, and that the elder two lived in a ménage à quatre with Samuel and Atiya Faizi, and then à trois once Zahra died. Equally, the very existence of timid Mahmuna Sultan and the strong-minded Begums of Bhopal also troubles the persistent myth that Muslim women, restricted by seclusion, were automatically limited in the amount of power or influence they could exercise. To travel at all was unusual for a South Asian Muslim woman in the Edwardian and pre-war period. For Maimuna and Atiyah to travel at a young age and unmarried, respectively, to do so with such an air of cosmopolitanism, and to publish accounts of their experiences was, to use Munisa Shamsi's word, truly remarkable. Finally, this discussion has suggested that more than a century ago, Atiyah and Maimuna were debating the ongoing and seemingly intractable problem of how to benefit from a Western education while maintaining South Asian Muslim mores. And in their travels and writings, these women writers encapsulate the famous, if disputed hadith, seek knowledge even if you have to go as far as China. They educate contemporary readers with their texts, observations, and the often bold ways in which they live. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. It just took me a while to unmute. Thank you so much, Claire. That was so fascinating, and thank you for the depth of research you seem to have gone through and sharing that with us today into the lives of these fascinating women of their time. I I think we should just kind of move on to Shahwar, and I'll keep all the questions towards the end. Just to say that in case any of you have questions, please use the chat feature in case and just type them out. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Shahwar.
Hi, Zehra. I would need to share my screen because I have to show a PowerPoint.
That's fine. You should see a share screen button.
All right, sure. So just if you can just confirm if my screen is visible. Yes, we
can see your screen. All good.
Excellent. Thank you. So I will be speaking about, of course, Saleha Begum Maqhfi, and we see that there's an effect on the word Maqhfi, and I've kind of made a little adjustment, and I'm calling her as the hidden poet of Calcutta, and we just unravel how and why that is happening. So just before that, just briefly, this is actually the first time I'm publicly sharing information on Saleha Begum Maqhfi, and I will henceforth be referring to her as SBM, who was an early 20th century poet and author based in Calcutta in West Bengal. And why is this important and why is this relevant for discussion now? Because she is one of those women writers, or rather she was exemplary of women who were writing in Urdu and in Farsi. So women writers who were involved in Indo-Persian literary production, but in say 20th century Bengal, and also in stark contrast to the huge corpus of literary work which was already evident in Bengali language or in the Bangla language. So this is also another point of focus, that there was also another coterie of writers who were working in Urdu and in Farsi, but not placed in Awadh, not placed in Delhi, but placed in Bengal and placed in Calcutta. So for this particular presentation, I am mostly banking on this book, which was a Tazkira, which was published in Urdu, titled Maghribi Bengal ke Urdu Shora 20वीं सदी में, or the Urdu writers of West Bengal writing in 20th century. This was compiled by Mushtaq Ahmad and published in 1972, who was, and this work was actually a result of his PhD thesis. So Saliha Begum, as we can see, Saliha Begum was her name, was her proper name, and Maqhfi was the pen name or the takhallus she used, and the exact translation of the word Maqhfi is of course poshida, or something which is hidden. That this is of course the literal translation of the word Maqhfi, but it can also be understood as something which is cryptic or something sacred or something mystical
I'm
in
so
that
sorry
sense.
to interrupt you, Shahwar. Have you changed your slide, or is it the same slide that you started off?
I
Because I thought you did. You were talking about something new, but that's all.
No, I have changed my slide actually. Is it not
No, we can just see the sort of the
the slide
chandelier.
is?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, is this visible now?
So what I see right now is a picture of what looks like a dargah,
Dargah.
or like there is a chandelier that says, and it says Hazrat Nizamuddin. Yeah.
Oh, so my screen is not visible then.
Oh,
My
yeah. Sorry
okay.
about that. I thought that was your PowerPoint because that
No,
was the
not.
first page.
Oh, no.
So yeah, I can see your your home page.
You
I
can
think your
see my
Apple.
desktop, so you
Yeah, I can
cannot
see your
see
desktop.
my.
Yeah.
Oh, you cannot see my presentation.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Have you emailed it to me? I'm happy to screen share if you've done that.
Uh, if it's not if this is a glitch, or if this is something, I would be happy to like resume after another speaker, maybe, if that is an option.
Yeah, I mean that's yeah, or have you just email the presentation to me, and I'm sure we can like
Sure.
that should be fine. But if you want just a minute, I can ask Haider or Saba if they're happy to start early, and then
Yeah,
we can move to you afterwards. But just email me a copy anyway of the presentation.
sure.
Saba or Haider or Professor Khanna, anyone. I'm sorry to call upon you like this. Uh, uh, would
Okay,
any of you
Zehra,
like to
I'm
sort of
happy
start
to
early?
present now.
Oh, okay, perfect.
I could
Thank you so
start.
much,
Yeah,
Saba.
yeah.
Sorry about that. So,
Thank you.
Shahwar will come to you after Saba then, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I had no idea that my screen was not visible.
Sorry
Yeah,
about that.
thank
No,
you
no,
so much. Thank you so much, Sabah, for.
thanks,
No
Saba.
worries, no
So,
worries.
yeah, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, yeah. Zehra, could you put up my presentation, please?
Second.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I didn't have that
Hi,
open.
everyone. I'm Saba. I'm going to be presenting my research in progress on Urdu women's magazines. While Zehra is putting up the presentation, a huge thank you to Shahbaz for organizing this and having me speak here. I think I didn't have enough to set in because I was just so excited about topics that are going to be discussed in this panel. And apologies in advance if I lose my voice during my presentation. I'm recovering from COVID. So I may need to take short breaks in between. So apologies about that.
I'm ready, by the way, with the presentation. So yeah,
Yeah,
happy
we can
to.
begin. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I'll just. Yeah, there you go. Can you see my? Can you see my screen?
Not at the moment.
Is that? Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
There is
I'll just.
a timer
Yeah,
dialog box at the top of it.
it's just Adobe asking me to spend money. But is that good?
Yeah. So I would like to begin with a quote. Can you go to the next slide, please?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a loose translation of a quote from the magazine Payame Ummeed. It was a magazine that was started in 1915 from Sitapur in Uttar Pradesh. This particular quote is undated, but it most likely appeared in the editorial section. What struck me immediately is first the candid nature of this comment. It involves the magazine speaking directly to its readership in a frank manner, and if I may add, with a degree of familiarity. Second, and perhaps a more interesting observation here, is the need to delineate a motive or a beneficial outcome. You see, from the outset, some Urdu magazines studied here defined their character as a platform for promoting women's writings and writings in women's interests, and many times writings that were reformative. A number of these magazines began with the motive of promoting women's education and literacy, and in their attempt to do so, I think that they created a platform for women to express their identities. This is the legacy that I want to delve deeper into with this presentation. I spoke earlier of the magazine speaking directly to their readership, and the publications studied here were perhaps some of the first publications in Urdu to do so in South Asia. They spoke directly to women, but the question that I began with is a variation of that statement. It is how are women speaking to themselves? How are they writing about themselves and writing themselves, as Tasawwur's team mentions? Next slide, please. And I want to clarify the scope of this study. My starting point and the most valuable resource for this research was Kalami Niswan. It's a wonderful book that translates and anthologizes pieces from 6 Urdu magazines. I will talk about these in a bit. It covers the period of 50 years, and they refer to multiple libraries and archives in Delhi, Patna, and Lucknow for their research. And it's really because of the groundwork done by Nirantar in this book that my own study exists. Next slide, please. Just to talk a little bit about the first Urdu periodicals and publications. So the first Urdu newspaper was started by Harihar Dutt in Calcutta in 1822. And the first Urdu monthly Kohinoor was started in 1850. Now, talking of publications with the aim of reforming society, in 1870, Tehzeeb-ul Akhlaq was started by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, and in 1899, Nairang-e-Alam was started by Maulana Abul Kalam Azad. It was around the same time, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that the first Urdu magazines for women began to appear. Tehzeeb-e-Niswan was started in 1898 from Lahore, and the first page of this publication asserted that it was the first Zanana Akhbar from Hindustan. It was published by Muhammadi Begum in partnership with her husband, with the aim of betterment for women. Khatun was started from Aligarh in 1904. It primarily carried writings on women's education and gave references to pieces that were penned by women. Next slide, please. Ismat was started from Delhi in 1908 by Sheikh Muhammad Ikram and Begum Ikram. And it carried the assertion that it carried chaste and literary writings and useful knowledge for honorable Hindustani wives. Payame Ummeed carried a strong message that can roughly be translated to awake, arise, and progress. Payame Ummeed brings a message of hope, and it identified itself as a moral, literary, and social magazine. Next slide. Ostani was also printed from Delhi in 1919, and it highlighted that it printed writings about women's lives with a progressive bent. And finally, Awaz-e-Niswan gave equal space to writings by women and men, and carried some religious and social themes, but also political themes. And the interesting thing about that is that it frequently advertised for books. Next slide, please. I now come to the whys of this research project. Since this panel has been dwelling in the archive, I wanted to study research publications and expanding the literary archive. magazines are platforms of limited means, but greater liberty, I think. And I believe this to be true of publishing even today. Magazines are more likely to build a community of readers and writers or correspondents. And in this case, especially the community in question is, of course, Muslim women. Nazir Ahmed, in the introduction of his best-selling classic, The Bride's Mirror, 1969, says that his motivation in writing the novel was that he couldn't find a single book that addressed women's lives and was written to be read by women. A few decades later, I would imagine these magazines filled that role. The magazines I'm studying were very much a part of starting this conversation. Readers could send letters to the editor, they could make suggestions, and there appeared to be a two-way conversation always. An instance I want to quote here is when the editor of Awazi Niswan could not include her piece in a January edition in the year 1940. And she wrote that she deeply regretted not being able to include her piece, and I quote, for the benefit of her sisters. And women often refer to each other as sisters in their letters to these magazines. They at times also exchange news about women's schools, forming a community of women readers. And most importantly, they did not compete with each other for readership. They highlighted their own niche and even acknowledged the work of other magazines in their statements. In 1910, Khatun carried a piece that essentially said that it was for the success of magazines like Tehzeeb-e-Niswan that Khatun had been created, that its interests coalesced but did not clash with those of Tehzeeb-e-Niswan and other publications, and it aimed to bring change in the thinking of men and women through its writing. Another reason for this research project is in many ways to evaluate my own biases. For me as a reader, it's far easier to accord complexity and diversity to contemporary writing. It's like a typical in-group, out-group situation where literary production of the previous century gets homogenized. This project then is a way to recover the diverse voices of women and to break that bias for myself. Can we go to the next slide, please? What comes across in these magazines is that women were writing in every form. There were essays, articles, stories, questions and answers, even commentary, etc. Khatun wrote once that it will try its best to present literary essays in an accessible and simple language. It attempted to give voice to writings by women with even the most mundane details of their daily experiences, and even dedicated 1/3 of their publication to offer this space. Additionally, it also talks about a special section that will carry articles with ideas of reform. Operating within the limits of its time, it assured its further observing readers that their letters would only be opened by the editor, Mrs. Abdullah, and they may dismiss all worries that no man could even lay hands on them. Now, women were often writing as daughter of, sister of, but at the same time, they were also reinventing themselves in creating pseudonyms like Alif-Bey Begum or Meen-Hey Begum. And my favorite, they were associating themselves with places, calling themselves Sahiba Lahori, for example. Next slide, please. So as this is the research in progress, I want to highlight the themes that the study sort of aims on. It's championing how these magazines champion women's education, how they promote reformative thinking, and how they make space for women's writing. I want to cite some examples here. In Tehzeeb-e-Niswan in 1927, there was an article by Zafar Jahan Begum called Schoolgirls, which talked about the roles of women in school and at home and the relationship between the two. And it likened mothers-in-law to school headmistresses looking for faults to correct in their daughters-in-law. And pieces like these spoke about the daily lived realities of women. another article called Women's Education and Their Status in Society in Khatun, published in 1911 by Abbasi Begum, argued for the equality of a man and a woman's intellectual life and for them to have the same educational opportunities. An interesting article is called Government Hawa Nahi. It's written by Aziza Khatun, was printed in Ustani in 1919. And amusingly, it urges women to engage with political debates of their time and says that if they shy away from the procedures of the government, then there could soon come a time when mothers would start to caution their children at bedtime, saying, sleep now or the government will come eat you up, making government to be some sort of a boogeyman. Next slide, please. So I just want to highlight some of the sources for my research. It is a Center for Gender and Education based in Delhi, and they published Kalami Quran. Zehra also does the brilliant work of digitizing, archiving these magazines, and you're sure to find editions in Urdu on their website. And for those interested in reading more, I've just mentioned a few key articles. That's it. Thank you so much for listening and to you that of controlling my presentation. Please do feel free to reach out if you're interested in discussing any of these topics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saba. This was so interesting, and it's fascinating what a wide variety of sources you've managed to compile together for your presentation. I will sort of quickly move on to Shahwar if you're ready to go now.
Yes, I am. If Zoom, my old friend, will let me have my way. Yeah.
I am totally happy to present it on your behalf, and maybe you can kind of just sort of, I'll obviously show the slides, but you can start off from where you were, just in the interest of time.
Yeah, sure. I hope you have the link. I just
I think I've got it already, so I'm just going to start sharing my screen.
So if we can start from slide number 3, please.
Yes. Sorry. Slide number 3, and
yeah, that looks good. That looks good.
Slideshow. Sorry, I'm just kind of all good.
Yeah, Zoom just loves me more. So we just I just mentioned, just to briefly talk about what I was talking about when the thing happened, is that we are of course talking about Saleha Begum Maqhfi, who represents this very small and very niche coterie of women writers in Bengal, who were writing, albeit in Urdu and in Farsi, in post-colonial era in 20th century Bengal, and located in Calcutta. So just quickly, Saleha Begum was her name, and Maqhfi was her takhallus, was her pen name. But in the literary circles of Calcutta, which was kind of dominated mostly by male poets and male writers, some of whom were also very dear friends of Saleha Begum Maqhfi and contemporaries, including Jamil Mazhari and Parvez Shahidi, Abbas Ali Khan Behud. They used to refer to her not as Begum but as Maqhfi Sahab. So that was also interesting, and these are just concepts I will just touch upon. Most of her literary works, most of her writings, most of her anthologies were with us for a very long time, but we lost most of it during the flood in Bengal, during the flood in Calcutta, which was sometime around I think the late 1970s, when my grandmother was also alive. But thanks to digital ethnography, which for me almost borders on the forensic, kind of shuffling between digital and forensic ethnography, what happened was that one of this book, very important book, Maghribi Bengal ke Urdu Shora, which, as I mentioned, is a taskira, which kind of creates a very helpful index. So this is slide 4, which kind of creates a very helpful index of prominent writers who were active in the Urdu literary circles of Bengal. makes a fleeting mention of Saliha Begum Maqhfi, and this is the book which I discovered very recently, and which has been very graciously archived on Rekhta, of all places, which is doing a terrific job of collecting this very vast repertoire of works in Urdu, and it has almost everything now. So it's certainly a force to reckon with. I mean, there are some even things in the Rampur library which you might end up finding in the Rekhta online, the Rekhta platform. So this forms actually the crux of my analysis in this particular presentation. This book, which was published in 1972 in Calcutta. Next slide, please. So just very quickly about Saliha Begum, she contrary to what is but mentioned in the book, she was born in Patna to Wahiduddin Ahmad, who was a judicial magistrate and who was also at the Patna High Court. And there is then another point of conflict, because the book states that she was born in 1924, but from what we know and from what we grew up hearing was that she was born sometime between 1914 1915. But now, since we have this conflicting piece of information, this again will require much more analysis and fact checking on our part. Another most very interesting part was that although she was born in Patna, she migrated to Calcutta with her aunt in around 1920s, 30s, and till that time she did not receive any formal education. She did not go to school, but she was homeschooled by a Maulvi Sahab, and she was very proficient in Urdu and Farsi. And this is what Mushtaq Ahmad, who has written about her in the Tazkira, he says that तालीम घरेलू है लेकिन उर्दू फारसी पर अच्छी नजर है और मुताला वसी है. So she although in spite of not receiving any kind of formal education, she was proficient in both Urdu and Farsi. Next slide. So coming back to how Saliha Begum Maqhfi became Maqhfi Sahab, this was actually a title which was given to her by another poet, also well known for writing during 20th century, during this time, which was Khurram Khalil Sahab. Since she started writing at a very young age. I mean, she was probably around 15, 16, 17 years old, perhaps. And since she was kind of understood as this prodigy who's so young, but then she became this force to reckon with. And she first got the attention of Jamil Mazhari Sahab, another very well-known figure in Urdu literature from Calcutta. And then her circle increased, and as her writings started gaining recognition, but mostly due to word of mouth and due to references, due to sharing and due to networking. So another of her colleagues would be Abbas Ali Khan Bekhud and Parvez Shahidi, as I had already mentioned. One more interesting thing was that she also often used to collaborate with Sughra Begum Sabzwari, who was another female intellectual writer, but she had an Iranian Shi heritage. Of course, based in Calcutta, but their immediate roots were from Iran. And so I'm guessing that perhaps her association with her might have been a driving force in her also gaining interest in Shi thought and Shi philosophy. But these are at this point, I mean, also like based on what I've heard from my mother and from my grandmother. At this point, this might be conjecture at best, but then again, another aspect which requires further exploration. Next slide. So quickly talking about her literary production, the book which we're discussing right now by Mushtaq Ahmed, that mentions that two of her most famous works were, of course, Jazwat-e Maqhfi, published sometime around 1937, which was basically a compendium. It was an anthology of Salam or Marsiyas, which were written in honor of Imam Hussain and the martyrdom of Imam Hussain. And another interesting aspect was that most of the salams which form part of this collection, they were performed in Imam Baras across Calcutta, and they were also part of our own family repertoire during and also part of our ritual performances during Muharram. Another important work was Naya Shekar, 1956, which was a collection of our prose writing. And what was interesting was that this was completely a novel in alliteration. So each page or each story began with a particular alphabet, and that entire book was alliterated. So there was the book began with, say, a story in Aleph. So every sentence in that story began in Aleph. So that was another work. Both of these, of course, again, were lost, but we are currently banking on digital archiving and also trying to contact Star Book Depot in Calcutta, which had originally published her works. So we are also trying to contact them to find out if they still have the original manuscript which was perhaps submitted during that time. So one more thing was that all the works, all the literature and the poetry and the stories which she was producing during this time, she was just writing that and just sending it out for publication. So as also Mushtaq Ahmed mentions in the Tazkira, that she did not go to anyone else for, say, second proofing or for copy editing or even for comments. So, and this is what he talks, he means when he says that kisi se islah nahi ki, that she did not send these books for proofing and for second checking, or so I'm not really sure what that means right now, but then that is an interesting thing to note. Next slide, please. So in addition to these books, fully authored books credited to her name, some of her works and mostly some of her short stories, in addition to her poems and in addition to her poetry, also used to regularly appear in this journal, Khatun-e-Mashriq, which was published during that time. It was published by Abdullah Farooqi, and their head office was located in Delhi 6th in Jama Masjid. This, of course, this also is something I found at Rekhta, which again has an impressive and very exhaustive collection of all Khatun-e-Mashriq journals, I think starting from 1940s. So I'm guessing this was also one of the volumes in which her works had appeared. This is from 1945, and this is volume number 4. Next slide, please. So again, I mean, leaving conjectures and speculations aside, although she grew up between Patna and between Calcutta, she nonetheless, can we go to slide number? Yeah, sure. So let's go. So although she grew up between these two places, she nonetheless grew with a very strong and very sensitive Hussaini temper, and she most of her works were mostly centered around the figure of Imam Hussein, and most of her work somewhere or the other tried to evoke some kind of she imagery and some kind of imagination of the space of martyrdom, of the space of sacrifice, of the space of this mystical surrender. And this might also be a reason why she chose Maqhfi as her pen name. So this is one of her marsiyas.
Yeah.
Which,
Sorry, Shahwar, to interrupt you. I just want to say that you have one more minute to wrap up.
Sure. I'll just wrap this up. So
Yeah.
this is her marsiya, which was performed in Imambaras across Calcutta. This is, of course, not available in the book, but this is this has been derived from oral history, which research which I conducted with members in my family. These are couplets which are, of course, available to read in the book, which I've centered my presentation on. Slide number 10. Yes, slide number 10, slide number 11. These are two sets of couplets. So now we come to slide number 13, where we quickly, slide number 13, please.
13, yeah.
Yeah. So this is where I will just quickly wrap up about not just what her literary output and what she was doing by creating poems or by creating these short stories. Another aspect of discussion of her persona was that she was also instrumental in establishing Anjuman Girls High School in Calcutta in collaboration with Ghulam Rasool Hadiwala, who was on the management then.
Yeah.
And it started with less than 10 students then, and also the foundation of the Howrah Orphanage. And I'll just finish with slide number, the second last slide. So
is it this one or
yeah,
that
this
one?
The second last slide.
Okay, great.
Yeah, this one. Thank you. So of course, this presentation, which was kind of rushed, it demonstrates, of course, methods of oral history research, historiography, and all of that. Not just to talk about independent Muslim women writers, intellectuals, and social reformers in 20th century Calcutta, but of course, the larger aim is to create discourse on women writers and Indo-Persian literary production in 20th century Bengal, and then tying it to my larger research on theorizing socio-cultural, musical, and political value making in Muslim culture wars in South Asian.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Shahwar.
you
Sorry, I'm so
Thank
sorry
you.
to have to rush you. It's just that we have two more speakers and Q&A to do as well. But this was fascinating, and both in some ways I found it quite tender in that you have explored your family history with such depth and detailing. So kudos to you on that. And with that, we can move on to Haider.
Yeah. So I'll just share my screen.
Great, yeah.
Okay.
Wonderful. Yeah, we can see your screen. Thanks, Haider.
Thank you so much. Before I start, just wanted to thank the Shahwar Collective and my co-panelists. I had the chance to learn from Professor Chambers while I was teaching in Lahore, and to learn from both Shahwar and Professor Khanna at UCLA. So very excited to present with this panel and very grateful for all of them being here. So I'm going to present on the journal Awaz. How do we create feminist, anti-imperialist, and third worldist imaginaries in Urdu that contest the narrow definitions of national and religious identity which have historically linked Urdu and the Muslims of South Asia? I hope to briefly point towards the editorial work of Fahmida Riaz for the Urdu magazine Awaz as one possible departure for such an imagination. And like many of my other co-panelists, I also am in debt to the good people of Rekhta for this archive. Born in Meerut in 1945, Fahmida Riaz grew up in Uttar Pradesh in colonial India and later after partition in Hyderabad, Pakistan. Her first marriage took her to London, but after it ended in divorce, she returned to Karachi and published her brilliant and controversial poetry collection, Badan Darida, which introduced modernist and feminist themes of eroticism, bodily desire, and sexuality to the Urdu lyric. Around the same time, she started a monthly magazine, Awaz, along with her second husband, the leftist activist Zafar Ali Ujan. Her role as the editor and publisher of the journal, which supported progressive movements and ideas, coincided with the imposition of martial law by Ziaul Haq. The magazine was critical of the military dictator's rule, and as a result, it was heavily surveilled by Zia's state, eventually culminating in the magazine being banned and both Riaz and her husband being charged with sedition. As a result, Riaz moved to India. She returned to Pakistan in 1987 and started a women's publishing house. In the coming decades, she wrote 3 novels, a novella, multiple poetry collections, as well as translations. She passed away in 2019. Beyond her strong criticism of Zia's dictatorial rule, her literary work as a writer, translator, critic, and editor displayed throughout her life worldly and transnational feminist concerns that contest narrow definitions of nationalism. Amina Yaqeen writes that Riaz's work draws attention to the plural tradition of regional literatures as well as multilingual Indic and Islamicate attachments which display concerns beyond state and nation. Sara Kazmi argues that in Riaz's work, Sindhi, Hindi, Arabic, Persian, and Braj idiom mingle freely with the polished conventions of Urdu verse, decentering its containment within any border, communal, or national. Similarly, Maryam Wasif Khan's analysis of Riaz's prose works shows how Riaz's usage of Urdu itself becomes a means through which the hegemonies of the nation state are disrupted. In Urdu, according to Khan, Riaz finds other imaginaries that put into crisis Pakistani state-sponsored narratives of origin and identity. Riaz's work as a translator also furthers this argument. Her translations of Rumi, Shams of Tabriz, Farrukh Farrukhzad, Najib Mahfouz, Shah Abdul Latif Bhittai, and Sheikh Ayaz exhibit her interest in both regional and transnational literatures that subvert the centrality of Urdu as a national language. The Pakistani state from its earliest existence tried to naturalize the link between language and religious identity, language and national identity. Indeed, as Alyssa Ayers argues, the case of Pakistan is emblematic insofar as it shows how language is central to the creation of national identity. Building on the brilliant work of Yaqeen, Kazmi, and Khan on the transnational feminist resonances of Riaz's work, I suggest that Fahmida Riaz's editorial work on Awaz contests the connection between Urdu and an exclusionary national identity by building connections between Urdu and other third world languages, literatures, and political movements through translation, showing in the process how Urdu may be conceived as a feminist, anti-imperialist, Marxist, and third worldist language, rather than a national language that asserts the masculinist, ethno-religious, and imperialist sovereignty of the post-colonial nation. Founded and edited by Fahmida Riaz in the late 70s, Awaz, a news and literary journal, quickly became a symbol of progressive resistance against the military dictatorship of Ziaul Haq. While functioning as a platform for Urdu writers and journalists who wanted to resist Zia's oppressive policies in Pakistan, it also generated transnational solidarities in the third world by publishing literary and journalistic works about anti-imperialist movements across the world, as well as translations of various literary writers from Asia, Africa, and the Soviet Union. I want to focus this short presentation on a single issue of Awaz, the 5th issue of the 4th volume published in 1981. The mission of this particular issue and of Awaz in general to some extent is articulated right at the beginning of the magazine in Fahmida Riaz's editorial. She writes, वो अदब कितना बांझ होगा जो गर्दो पेश रोनुमा होने वाले तारीख साज वाक़यात और सानहों का अक्स तक पेश न कर सके जब करोड़ों हम असर इंसान अपनी बाहों के बल से तारीख का रुख मोड़ते हों और अदब इनके पसीने से तर हामती हुई कहानियां ना लिख सके. How barren will a literature be if it cannot even reflect the historic events and incidents happening all around it? If it cannot write breathless stories drenched in the sweat of millions of contemporary people who are turning the direction of history with the power of their own hands. To this end, the issue included translations of the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, the Soviet writer Alexander Grin, and an unidentified writer from South Africa whose story Shanakhti Card, Identity Card, presented a painful account of apartheid. Other than translations, the issue also included an essay comparing the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution and the military coup of Augusto Pinochet in Chile, an interview of the painter Sumbul Nazir, an essay on the Bangladeshi singer Runa Lela, poems by the Indian poet Gitanjali, and an essay by Fahmida Riaz herself about the 2 years she spent at the London Film School, particularly her group of friends at the school, which included people from Australia, Egypt, Brazil, Somalia, and Greece. The issue is a snapshot of Riaz's intersectional political and literary concerns. Her interest in third world literatures is represented by Tagore, Gitanjali, and South African literature. Her interest in feminist creative expressions is represented by Sumbul Nazir and Runa Lela, among others. Her interest in Marxism is represented by reflections on Chile, as well as by the literary writings of modern socialist Urdu writers such as Firdaus Haider and Kishore Nahid. Her editorial vision brings all these different threads together, placing them within modern Urdu language and literature, making it impossible to disentangle them from each other. The style or tone of the journal reflects this hybridity, moving from the direct prose of journalistic pieces to the poetic experiments of Faiz and Nahid. Reading the magazine allows us unique insight into the personal concerns of Riaz, as well as the broader cultural and political concerns that captured a progressive Urdu audience in the early 80s. Instead of simply looking at a single poem or author, reading the magazine as a whole allows us to see how literary communities are built, how different writers and concerns are brought into a reciprocal dialogue with each other, especially through translation. The issue also included Faiz Ahmad Faiz's Urdu poem Shohdae Falastin Ke Naam for Palestinian martyrs. Faiz wrote the poem in 1980, a year before its reproduction in Awaz, when he was still living in exile in Beirut and editing the Afro-Asian magazine Lotus. The poem, written in the voice of a Palestinian exile, is a testament to anti-imperialist resistance. जिस ज़मीन पर भी खुला मेरे लहू का परचम लहलहाता है वहाँ अर्ज़े फ़लस्तीन का अलम. Wherever I unfurled my flag of blood, in that land flies the flag of Palestine. Awaz paired Faiz's poem with an Urdu translation of the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish's poem Anal Umniyat, concerning wishes, translated into Urdu as Seher Ka Wada, the promise of dawn. The poem situates Palestinian resistance within, as Zaina Masri writes, a historical map of anti-colonial and anti-imperial insurrections, citing Algeria, Yemen, Havana, Aswan, and Congo, yet stresses its autonomous moment. Darwish, of course, himself lived in exile for nearly 2 decades, many of those years like Faiz in Beirut, and exile serves as a central analytic in the representation of the Palestinian struggle in his and in many other people's works. Interestingly, soon after the publication of this issue of Awaz was banned and Riaz charged with sedition. She also went into exile, living in India for nearly 7 years, only to return after Zia's death. The personal exiles of the writers can be read in parallel to the exilic status of Urdu itself as conceived by Awaz. The magazine, through this multiple play of exile, seems to be pushing Urdu literature out of the national imaginary, out of its designation as a unique cultural repository of an exclusionary and hegemonic national identity, into a transnational and translational space of exilic affiliations, of reciprocity and solidarity, the space of the third world, populated as it was by the kind of exile that contests the very boundaries of inside and outside, us and them, the boundaries that sustain narrow definitions of nationalism. For Frantz Fanon, one of the most important thinkers of anti-colonialism, the revolutionary promise of nationalism was threatened by the twin forces of national bourgeoisie and imperialist forces in the global north. All around him, he witnessed anti-colonial nationalism devolving into what he called tribalism, chauvinism, and hyper-nationalism. These movements were more interested in narrowly defining cultural and national identities for the purposes of political and economic exploitation, rather than truly serving the colonized and oppressed peoples of the world. He warned that if nationalism is not made explicit, if it is not enriched and deepened by a very rapid transformation into a consciousness of social and political needs, in other words, into humanism, it leads up a blind alley. He supported Pan-Africanism, Afro-Asian solidarity, and other movements rooted in anti-imperialist internationalism. He believed that new political and literary forces emerging from anti-colonial solidarities, such as the first Afro-Asian conference held at Bandung in 1955, could contest both narrow nationalisms and global imperialism. In the example of Riaz's Awaz, we can see a literary project in the long historical shadow of Bandung that rejected both Pakistan's narrow exclusionary view of nationalism and its most important supporter, the neo-imperialism of the United States of America and its global allies. Awaz tried to imagine a literary relational space where Urdu could learn and share anti-imperialist stories across differences of nation and language through the crucial role of translation. By orienting itself towards other radical political struggles and creative expressions in the global South, struggles in Palestine, Iran, South Africa, and Bangladesh, it attempted to translate into Urdu the possibility of a whole new imagination of both national and world literature. Rooted in South-South feminist and anti-imperialist communities and in exilic solidarities of progressive movements, Riaz's editorial work shows us how we might begin to think of Urdu not as a national language, but as a translational and transnational language that builds what Shumeshi calls an ethics of reciprocity amongst the oppressed. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Haider. That was a fascinating presentation, and honestly, quite wonderful to see all of these covers. Just visually was very, very engaging as well. So thanks a lot. We will now move on to our last panelist for the day, and our featured speaker, Professor Neetu Khanna, who will be speaking on the visceral logics of decolonization. Thanks so much for joining us, Professor Khan. I hope it's not some ungodly hour for you.
No, it's okay. No.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much, and thank you to my panelists, such amazing archival work, and thank you so much to the organizers of this amazing conference. What a dream for this to be a full conference and not just some marginal panel in the corner. So thank you so much, and I know that coordinating internationally is probably no joke, so really appreciate it. So let me share screen, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll Zehra, can you just give me a warning when I'm around 20 minutes or 19 minutes?
Yeah,
Okay.
I will. Actually, Haider has actually thankfully sort of kept his presentation was shorter than the 15 minutes, so you have about 22 minutes, so that should be good.
22 is perfect.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. All right, so this talk comes out of a recent book that called The Visceral Logics of Decolonization, which centers on the Marxist movements within Indian decolonization and nationalism, what has been called the progressive legacy in the history of Indian literary production, roughly between the 1930s, 1950s, 1960s. These are the authors that organized under the title of the Progressive Writers Association, the PWA, or IPTA, the Indian People's Theater Association. And in the book, I was exploring what I was calling the visceral aesthetics of these writers, and I was exploring these aesthetics as a kind of critical dimension of Marxist theories of revolutionary consciousness, but also the anti-colonial political thought that's born within this internationalist moment. And in the talk today, I'm actually going to be drawing on a chapter of the book where I'm thinking with, this remarkable pair of leading Muslim feminist activists and authors, Rashid Jahan and her student Ismat Jogdai, which has come up already. And in this chapter, I'm really thinking about their feminist interventions into the progressive writers movement that were so central to animating debates surrounding decolonization in India between the 1930s and 1950s. So these two authors, along with the progressive writers, adopted Soviet socialist realism as their formal aesthetic coming out of Russia, the Writers' Congress. And so also this project tracks, and this archive tracks this very interesting aesthetic circuit between South Asia and Russia, and the kind of Indo-Soviet circuits of aesthetic production, and which I'm currently working on in my next project. But these writers were also deeply influenced by European modernism, infused within their Urdu literary experiments. as well as the psychoanalytic writings of Sigmund Freud, to just name a few of the kind of very varied transnational influences that you see inflected in their writing. Both of these feminist figures are known for their incendiary gender critiques of both colonialism and Indian Muslim orthodoxies, and much of their literature was banned. Of course, Ismat Jogdai is perhaps most well known for the obscenity charges waged against her by the colonial government in the 1940s for the homoerotic content of her literature. So this is a picture here in early days of the progressive writers. Rashid Jahan is on the far right side. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to mostly be talking about Rashid Jahan. And I do want to take a second to say how excited I am to see the keynote is Zehra Maqhfi today, whose work is so foundational and whose translations, particularly of the Ismat Jogdai, are, I'm incredibly indebted to those translations, and it's so foundational for our conversations and for this field. Because of her, at least 100 students of mine read Ismat Jogdai in the American University every semester. So I'm very excited to hear her speak. So here's another picture of Jahan. Here's Ismat Jogdai in her, her iconic amazing writing position. She's always kind of draped over some couch or a bed. Famously, she chewed ice while she was writing. This was a little Google doodle for her 107th birthday in 2018. Okay, so what I thought I would do today is actually focus on one short story, one Urdu short story by Jahan, and actually just work through it pretty slowly. So I apologize, it's very nerdy literary reading. But I want to work through it in order to draw out what's at stake and an attention to the visceral dimensions of Jahan and Jogdai's writing, and what's at stake, particularly in relationship to their feminist political interventions during this era of kind of social upheaval and decolonization. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in this book and in this chapter is about a kind of feminist phenomenology that emerges, or a kind of philosophy of experience that emerges. So you'll see sort of placing Jogdai and Jahan in relationship to a number of phenomenological thinkers. So I'll get started. So Rashid Jahan's activism was wide-ranging. She offered women's healthcare in lower caste and class communities, educated women in reproductive health and marriage rape in sweepers colonies, held adult education classes. She ran her own gynecological medical practices, participated in trade union rallies and protest marches, wrote articles for her own political magazine, and authored and orchestrated political street theater. Jahan was a doctor, an accomplished journalist, a short story writer, and a playwright. And so I actually want to frame this reading with two critical theoretical insights by Anne Stoller and Parma Roy surrounding the place of emotion within the colonial project that I think become important for this conversation. So I'll just read really quickly. Anne Stoller writes, sorry, I'm having trouble seeing the screen here. Colonial authority rested on educating the proper distribution of sentiments and desires. Domains of the intimate are strategic for exploring two related but often discreetly understood sources of colonial control, one that works through the requisition of bodies, and a second that molds new structures of feeling, new habits of heart and mind that enable these categories of difference and subject formation. In this talk today, I take up disgust as a case study to explore what I'm calling the visceral logics of decolonization in the book. And here I'm centering its role in the gendered discipline of the female body in late colonial India, the regimes of proper taste and sentiment, proper desires in the words of Stoller. As literary critic Parma Roy writes, colonial politics often spoke in a visceral tongue, manifesting itself in the production of new forms of appetite, new notions of health and hygiene, and new modes of disgust, end quote. What little has been written on Rashid Jahan centers on her sparse but remarkable short story, Woe, or That One, which depicts an encounter between a young female teacher and a prostitute she meets in a clinic. Jahan centers the short story on the gendered subaltern figure of the prostitute. A young middle-class woman newly graduated from college working at the women's school narrates the story. She closely resembles Jahan, who herself was a part of a generation of middle-class Muslim women trained in Western gynecology by the British colonial government. As Rakshanda Jalil writes, the action in this short story takes place in a newly opened space, a public space, the women's school and the hospital, where women from different social classes meet, an encounter that was inconceivable even a decade earlier. One day, the narrator encounters a woman, one she finds out is a prostitute, who comes to the clinic for treatment. The prostitute's face has become so disfigured as a result of venereal disease that the other workers in the clinic revile and disgust when they see her. They refuse to touch the chair she sits on and repeatedly curse her repulsive and depraved presence. So this is in translation. Okay. I first met her at the hospital. She had come there for treatment. Seeing her, the other women turned away. Even the doctor's eyes strained shut in disgust. I felt repulsed too, but somehow managed to look straight at her and smile. She smiled back, or at least I thought she tried to. It was difficult to tell. She had no nose. 2 raw gaping holes stood in its place. She had also lost one of her eyes. To see with the other one, she had to crane her neck around. Jahan then heightens this grotesque depiction with this detail. Often the 2 raw holes in her face were running. Later, this nameless, faceless woman, referred to by the others as Wo or that one, finds the narrator at her workplace, a women's school. When that one arrives, the narrator holds back her revulsion and offers her a seat. That one presents the narrator with a flower. The narrator holds back her disgust at the mere touch of the flower, but tucks it behind her ear. A daily ritual begins. That one visits the narrator at the school and says nothing, and presents her with a flower, which the narrator tucks behind her ear, holding back her revulsion. Returning to the story, this intimate daily ritual, a kind of distorted romance of sorts between that one and the narrator, brings the narrator to a state of panic and crisis, for the women at the school become increasingly agitated and indignant regarding that one's presence. The unrelenting presence of the subaltern figure in the story thrusts the narrator into a state of crisis and a stream of self-reflection. I felt awkward and humiliated. I was being made into an object of humiliation in school. Still, whenever she placed a flower before me, I would tuck it into my hair, and her face would again crease into that horrifying smile. Why does she stare at me like this? Who is she? What has she been? Where did she come from? How has she become like this? And then another perplexing detail. There she sat, just gazing at me with that crooked eye and that ghastly noseless face. The narrator declares, "Sometimes I thought I saw her eye fill. What was passing through her mind?" So the privileged gaze here is thus inverted. The entire scenario is so brilliantly turned inside out. For what is highlighted over and over again in the grotesque imagery of the subaltern figure is that we quite literally see her insides, but have no access to her interiority. This frustrates the narrator, making impossible the grounds for feminist empathy, and at the same time granting an unwanted access to the nameless woman's biological insides. Instead, we are offered this raw topography of the unbounded woman's bodies, its horrific openings to the world. The woman's bodily fluids run and fill and ooze, untethered, as it were, to the emotions that they index. The narrator can only speculate that she sees the prostitute's eye fill, as she is looking to read this somatic reflex as a gateway into the woman's emotions and consciousness. It's all soma, no psyche. In Jahan's short story, That One, the narrator is oriented to the figure of the prostitute in a clever logic of inversion, a literal and figurative turning inside out. With the erosion of the subaltern subject's face, Jahan denies any idealized revolutionary feminist interface between the narrator and That One. Jahan centers the narrative crisis on the young and naively idealistic doctor struggling to find compassion amidst her revulsion for the nameless, faceless prostitute. Ramvada Gopal argues the story ought to be read as a reflection and auto-critique surrounding the failure or limits of empathy and women's solidarity across class boundaries. Framed by an ironic self-criticism of the narrator's own naive aspirations as feminist, activist, and reformer, the story thus centers on her unlearning of her privilege and political optimism. And I agree with Gopal, but I also want to ask what it means that we are forced to read the female subaltern, not simply through her effacement and her opacity, but through her grotesque disfigurement, the hollow cavities of her face and the viscous fluids running out of them. Indeed, any easy experience of empathy or even pity for the subaltern against any easy experience of empathy or pity, the reader becomes implicated within this theater of revulsion. And here I seek to foreground the deep anxieties set into action by the unbounded body of the prostitute in these modernizing spaces at the brink of decolonization. The aversive force of this disgust operates through an entanglement of visual and tactile registers. Quote, nobody would sit in the chair she used. I don't blame them, the narrator tells us. It wasn't their fault. She looked so revolting. I couldn't bring myself to touch the chair either, end quote. Fear of intimacy with the subaltern frames the feminist politics of this short story, and here amplified by the affective idiom of disgust, focused here through the anxious prospect of touch. As German phenomenologist Aurel Kolnay writes of disgust, the central feature of disgust is the proximity and bodily intimacy of the disgusting object, for it is the threat of contact with the dangerous substance that triggers the aversive response. The disgust directed at the prostitute and the fear of intimacy that underwrites it is further heightened by the prospect of contact with the bodily fluids leaking out of the unbounded body. However, what exactly is the nature of the threat that this leaking and oozing body poses? For this, I would argue, is the site of Jahan's political critique. So this is a quote from Kolnay's Phenomenology of Disgust. The principal feature of the disgusting is its somehow obtrusive clinging to the subject, its shameless and unrestrained forcing itself upon us. The fear of intimacy inscribed within the disgust of the unbounded subaltern, in fact, becomes particularly heightened by the end of the story. The story concludes with the nameless woman blowing her nose and wiping her fingers on the wall, amplifying the revulsion already associated with the liquids of her interiors, oozing and running out of her face. Suggestively, it is the woman who cleans the school, the sweeper woman who works in the school, who loses all control and begins senselessly beating that one, the prostitute. Quote, you bastard, you whore, who do you think you are? Yesterday you were loitering at the street corner, and today as your flesh falls rotting apart, you parade here like a lady, end quote. The story focuses the mucus on the wall as that which incites the sweeper woman's seemingly uncontrollable moment of physical aggression directed towards that one. What is the nature of this disgust, this knee-jerk gut reaction to which we become witness and perhaps also experience? To invoke in a phenomenological register, how is the sweeper woman moved to violence in and through this disgust and disgusting object? And what does it mean that Jahan mobilizes this disgust to invite us into a politics of intimacy that refuses empathy? In this short story, Rashid Jahan stages this powerful feminist critique of colonial technologies of hygiene and sexual propriety in her literature as the fashioning of disgust becomes integral to the production of the modern Muslim woman, and the question of the potential Indian citizen hangs in the balance of an emergent Indian nationhood. What is so provocative about this sparse story is that the disgust that sets the sweeper woman upon the unbounded body of the prostitute invokes a series of logics that traffic between the physical and moral reflexes. The disgust directed at the nameless woman's physicality, the gaping holes, the liquids oozing out of them, all come to stand in for a moral disgust directed towards her life of prostitution. When teaching this story, for example, I ask my students their interpretation of this final climax, that moment of violence.
Sorry to interrupt, Neetu, just 5 minutes.
Okay,
You wanted me to tell you, right?
So when I'm teaching this story, I always ask them what they make of this final scene. And in discussing their responses, it becomes particularly difficult, almost impossible, to disentangle the grotesque physicality of the subaltern as an object of visceral disgust from the implications of caste, practices of untouchability, and the life of prostitution, and the specter of venereal disease, and the labor of sex work as object of moral disgust. So there's this entanglement between the kind of physical repulsion and the moral repulsion or revulsion. As Sarah Ahmed writes, and this is from the Cultural Politics of Emotion, feelings of disgust stick more to some bodies than others, such that they become disgusting, as if their presence is what makes us sick. And then this is another quote up here. It's not that an object we might encounter is inherently disgusting, rather an object becomes disgusting through its contact with other objects that have already, as it were, been designated as disgusting before the encounter has taken place. While disgust involves a metonymic slide, it does not move freely. It sticks to that which it is near, it clings. And so this is some early thinking of what develops into Hamid's queer phenomenology. A series of layered and imbricated logics of caste, sexuality, class, power, and alterity are set into crisis by these scenes of prohibited touching, set against the restructuring of these gendered public spaces in late colonial India. And this leads us to question, what is the relationship between the moral disgust and visceral reflex? How does one get folded into the other? And what is the nature of this fear of intimacy with the subaltern that drives the sweeper woman paradoxically to violent contact with a disgusting object? I want to suggest here that the fluids of the female body play a key role in this metonymic transaction, the unspeakable body fluids that recall the sexual fluids of the female body, invoking both the prostitute's social depravity, her exploitation, as well as her sex work. In amplifying the sensory aesthetics of colonial disgust, Jahan locates the threat of female sexuality in the viscous fluids that serve as the object of repulsion. R.L. Kolnai writes that the principal feature, if R.L. Kolnai writes that the principal feature of the disgusting is its somehow obtrusive clinging to the subject, revising Kolnai through Jahan's feminist phenomenology, what is brought to light is how the viscous properties of female bodily fluid, the gooey and oozing properties of sensory excess, the sticky mucus smeared and clinging so defiantly to the wall, also seamlessly slides into social discourse of moral excess, a discourse of shame. How is it, in other words, that a texture becomes shameless, or that is registered as in the body as threatening? And here I must admit that I'm reading Jahan's provocative yet very sparse short story through the aesthetics of her own student, Isma Juqtai. Juqtai's literature is saturated with these kinds of depictions of unspeakable textures of the female body. Juqtai, however, invokes these metonymic logics of female bodily texture, its stickiness, its viscosity, and takes it to its erotic conclusion. It is how the very materiality of the female body becomes the heightened object of violent regimes of bodily control in India, late colonial India, that provides the historical frame of Juqtai and Jahan's stories. My interest in Jahan and Juqtai's aesthetics of disgust derives from the way female bodily textures, unspeakable as they are, activate and animate visceral impulses of aversion, desire, disgust, aggression. I argue that Jahan and Juqtai envisioned revolution as not simply a transformation of social consciousness, but as a deeply embodied revolution that would be predicated on the possibility of making the female body mean differently, to borrow Jennifer Fleischner's articulation. The narrator of Woe cannot deactivate her own instinctive revulsion in the face of the prostitute, regardless of her enlightened feminist consciousness. Jahan turns our attention to where the innate reflex of disgust is shaped by the social and historical forces that naturalize the threat of the other. In this reading of her story, I propose that Jahan asks us to reimagine the emotional labor of a Marxist and internationalist feminist practice to account for the visceral logics in which colonial relations of power are inscribed. For such an embodied logic cannot be simply overturned through an intellectual or even emotive exercise in feminist empathy or solidarity. Decolonization here and the project of feminist solidarity then calls for an epistemological overhaul that cannot simply be attained through an exercise in affect, but calls for some other kind of affective labor altogether. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neetu. That was fascinating and indeed very rich in terms of the close reading that you've done and the meanings that you've managed to tease out from Rasha Jahan and Juqtai's work. So, and also just in terms of how they're speaking to each other, excellent work. Thank you so much.